Okay, we are live
All
on
right.
this Halloween, huh? I didn't even know it was Halloween until you guys told me it was Halloween. Wow.
Mhm.
All right,
You didn't. You
with
didn't. You
us.
didn't. You didn't see our costumes. We're dressed up as very concerned geopolitical analysts. That's
That's
right.
right. That's right. We are very concerned, and we are geopolitical analysts. And we have with us Alexander Mercouris, geopolitical analyst out of London. And we have with us the one and only Mr. Matthew Ehret. How are you doing, Matthew?
I'm doing really good for all that can be considered. I'm doing well, and I'm looking forward to our chat.
All right. Well, we got a lot to discuss. Let's say a quick hello to everybody that is watching us on Rockfin, on Odyssey. Hello to everyone on Rumble, Locals, the Duran.locals.com. How is everyone in the Locals chat doing? And hello to everyone that's watching us on YouTube. Hello to our awesome and amazing moderators. Valies is with us today. Tish is with us as well. And who else? I think those are our moderators for now. So a big hello and a big thank you to everyone that is moderating. Alexander, Matthew, we do have a lot to discuss, but before we get into it, where's the best place for people to find you, Matthew?
Well, I guess the most convenient place would be CanadianPatriot.org or RisingTideFoundation.net. Those are the two main platforms. And there's also my Substack, MatthewEhret.substack.com.
Okay, and I will have a link to all of that in the description box down below and as a pinned comment when the live stream is over. Are you guys hearing an echo from my end? Let me know in the chat. Anyway, let me know if there's an echo, and I'll try to sort it out. Alexander, Matthew, let's discuss what is going on in the world today.
Yeah.
Now, and whom better to discuss it with Matthew, who's able to draw all the things together and provide us with a common thread. So we have wars in the Middle East, a terrible war in the Middle East, playing out in a most extraordinary way around the world. This is the first Middle East war, by the way, which in my opinion has become global in its significance. We've had Middle East wars before, many of them. We had Middle East wars in 1967. I just remember it. It's at the tip of my memory. I remember the 1973 war very well. But those wars were wars in the Middle East, and they concerned the interactions primarily beyond the Middle East of the two superpowers of that era, which were the United States and the Soviet Union. And of course, there was the Third World, as we called it, rather dismissively in those days. And it had opinions, but one didn't really think they mattered very much. Now it is completely different. We have China weighing in and weighing in very big. China meeting, or China sending its foreign minister to Washington, and the president and the secretary of state and the national security advisor have to step outside and meet this Chinese foreign minister and hold detailed discussions with him. We have other countries, we have ASEAN weighing in, making their own opinions about what's going on very clear. We've had very intense and fierce debates in the UN Security Council. And contrary to what a lot of people are saying, I actually think that the United Nations is becoming more, not less important, the more multipolar it all is. And the United States on the defensive in this conflict. We've had articles appearing now in places like Time magazine, which basically are saying that the war in Ukraine is being lost. Huge article about Zelensky, and just in advance saying things about Zelensky, which I never expected ever to see. We're starting to see the real person behind all the illusions that have been sold to us for very long. And of course, Europe completely nowhere, and the British, about whom I'm sure Matthew will have much to say. In my opinion, many of these problems, the problems of the Middle East, even to some extent the problems in Eastern Europe, are a legacy of British imperial policies and of British imperial thinking. Mackinder and all of that, and the role of Ukraine and the supposed importance of Ukraine in terms of global geopolitics, and of course a disastrous legacy left by Britain in the Middle East, one which to my mind is at the source of all of these problems. Yeah. So Matthew, we have a huge amount to talk about. Those are just some of the things that I think we could talk about, but no doubt you can say very, very much else. But both of us I live in the metropolis of the former empire, London. You live in one of its outlying colonies. The British still sometimes refer to Canada, believe it or not, as a colony. It's extraordinary to hear that. Dominion, as it is still, the Queen, or rather the King, is still your sovereign head of state. I think you will have much to say about all of that. But what other things do you want to touch on?
Oh, I really appreciate the space that you created. I mean, you've painted, I think, a good brushstroke thumbnail sketch to fill out and to play around in. I couldn't agree more. And indeed, although we have had ongoing crises in the Middle East, really going back to the Crusades, but obviously in our lifetimes, we've seen quite a bit of it. We've never had such a context, such a global dynamic chemistry as unique as what we have today, with what I think is one of the most important variables of the systemic breakdown of the very structures of the transatlantic financial system, which are now breaking down. I mean, you could say that they already really took a spiral downward, a major shift in the dissolution of the Western banking system that was built up. I guess in its current form, really a watershed moment was that 1971 period of the detaching of the dollar onto the floating exchange rates, the removal of the fixed exchange, the gold reserve standard, which allowed for a new epoch of speculation, speculative warfare, and in the type that we saw with the new mercenary class of Soros, quantum management, hedge fund arsonists deployed to carry out a new approach to economic terrorism against nations that were not cooperative with the new rules of the New World Order game that was being put into motion by the Trilateral Commission of David Rockefeller and Kissinger and Schultz and others. So that whole era that some called the consumer society model, where we would become post-industrial, we would outsource our heavy industry to cheaper and cheaper labor markets in order to meet the needs of dollaramas, that would then increasingly, become something we became addicted to as our dollar, or our increasingly in the European zone that was deindustrialized as well. The value of currency was devalued. The purchasing power was reduced in time as we became less productive. And we lost that vitality, right? That you need to have a viable capitalism that maintains itself. You have to have a commitment to an industrial measurable output that is tied to your investments and other things. If your investments and your idea of economic value become just something that is disassociated from reality to the point that you think you could make money with money, and that money can be tied to increasing rates of debt, and that debt can be tied to increasing rates of bundled imaginary assets that you insure upon that become derivatives, then you can all of a sudden find yourself, like we have, in a Titanic, thinking that it was a viable ship, which has something like $40 trillion or 40 times more derivatives, which I think are something in the magnitude of $1.2 quadrillion. I've seen competent economists deliver certain metrics or estimates. They're very hard to measure. I think the official number from the IMF is like $780 trillion of derivatives floating around, which are something like 10 to 20 times more than the world measurable GDP. So that is a factor that we didn't have in 1967, in 73, or in the Intifadas, or in anything. We didn't have that Western breakdown system or process, and we also didn't have such a coherence of civilizational states either, which we have. Like, obviously Iran is in a much different position now than it was when Wesley Clark was delivering his warnings bravely to the American world people, that he was informed back in the 90s by the architects of the clean break doctrine of Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, that whole neocon crowd, who told him, Wolfowitz, he says directly in his several speeches in 2004, 2007, 2008, that Wolfowitz told me that not only are we going to need to get Iran Iraq into a regime change, but then Syria, then Iraq, then Syria, then Libya, then Lebanon, and Iran is the big one. And he points it all out, today's Iran is different. Today's Iran has strategic security and economic partnerships with China, with Russia. And on top of that, you have a general orientation, as you guys have eloquently pointed out again and again, for those with ears to hear, an orientation towards building a viable multipolar system, supporting and giving actual meaning to the otherwise meaningless UN Charter, which has had no respect over the course of the last 70 years of rules-based hegemony logic. So that's something new. And we're seeing the West, I think, go through a bit of a Rumpelstiltskin moment of just their name has been called. The name of Rumpelstiltskin has been called out. We're seeing erratic behavior on a variety of levels, and a lot of the charms, the magic spells, the formulas that had worked every single time they were applied, whether for 9/11 or whether for even again the 6-Day War, which I've increasingly discovered looks like it was a bit of an inside job. I was a bit shocked to scratch on that one, but not that surprised, I guess. But a lot of these spells are no longer working the way that they used to work so well in the past. So that's interesting. And as you pointed out, the British hand is sort of smelly and everywhere as far as Anglo-American intelligence operations. Everywhere you look and scratch, you start seeing some signs, whether competent or not. I mean, I think in a lot of cases we're dealing with a reduced competence of some of these intelligence operations that are there. I mean, playing a variety of players, even inside of Hamas, I believe, is not necessarily representing fully the interests of the people of Palestine. But despite that, you have, intelligence operations inside of Israel working against the interests of the Israeli people who are not happy about this by and large either. So overall, it's interesting.
I mean, to me, actually, it all looks like the beginning of the end of an imperial structure that actually goes back to Britain. I mean, it was the British who first created in the 19th century a global financial system. People often overlook this, but that was what the British actually did. I mean, the system that we have today is ultimately an evolution of what the British set out to do in the 19th century. They created modern banks. They created these interconnections between banks. They set up the whole system of international trade. I used to do an awful lot of maritime trade law, and I remembered how much of it was based on British legal principles and British insurance systems, and that was global. I mean, that was as recently as the 1980s. It was the global system that the British created in the 1980s, rather in the 19th century, and which has, found its way today. And of course, what happened was that in the 1920s and 30s, and even more so from Bretton Woods, the Americans basically took that over, and they took that over through a kind of consensual process, which I think again isn't fully understood, but the British were aware that they no longer had the strength to implement all of that, to keep it all going any longer. So there was a very deliberate decision gradually to transfer the focus of power from London to Washington. But I think you're absolutely right. I look at the competence of this and I compare what it was like. I mean, how much more efficiently the British ran their empire in the 19th century, how much more successfully and efficiently the Americans ran things. When I was, a little toddler at the time of the 6-Day War, how much more successful and competent the Americans were in those days, and how completely they've lost those skills today. It's like those skills have atrophied. So I can remember when Kissinger used to fly around the Middle East. I remember it very well with his shuttle diplomacy. He would be in Riyadh one day talking to King Faisal, then he'd fly off to Cairo and talk to Sadat. Then he'd be off to Damascus and he'd be talking with Assad, not the Assad we have now, but the father, Hafez al-Assad. And then, of course, he'd go off to Israel and he'd be talking to Golda Meir or whoever the prime minister of Israel was at that time. I think it was still Golda Meir. And he would be doing it and everybody would talk to him and they would be very deferential to him because he was the leader, the foreign policy representative, not just of the United States, but ultimately the person who was in charge of the overall global system. And now I have to say, I see the president of Egypt being frankly, openly rude to the US Secretary of State on television. And I hear of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia keeping the US Secretary of State waiting a whole night before he speaks with him. And you see all of these moves now that are taking place in the UN, the way in which various states are all coordinating and cooperating with each other. Sorry, I have to deal with a dog. I don't think that people have noticed that every single draft resolution which has been proposed to the Security Council since the start of this crisis, bar one, the one that was proposed by the United States, all of the others, the ones proposed by Russia, the ones proposed by Brazil, the meeting of the Security Council that took place yesterday and which I believe continues today, which was called by China and the UAE, these are all BRICS states. They're all either existing members of the BRICS, like China and Russia and Brazil are, or like the UAE is, they're going to become members of the BRICS in just a few weeks' time. And clearly, they're all working together. They're all working together as a team, coordinating with each other. And they're doing so at a global level in ways that has never happened before. So the empire has lost the initiative. It is no longer in control.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And I do have a certain amount of trepidation because I don't know to what extreme the empire is willing to completely kick over the chessboard, as was done in many previous cases throughout history, when they feel like they don't have any hands left to play. We've seen this, of course, in the late 19th century. There's I've written about this. I know you guys have talked about this, but there was a spread of national sovereign economic systems developing and spreading with rail focus, industrial focus, protectionism around the world in the 1880s and the 1890s. We saw this with the adoption of Lincoln's program of political economy in Russia with his allies like Alexander II, who was assassinated by a London-directed anarchist cell group that was very closely tied to the Okhrana. We had the same thing with Sadi Carnot, in the president of France, who was also adopting a robust system of pro-industrial development, even working with a foreign policy to assist in the building of the Suez Canal with Egypt back in the 1860s, 1865 period. That had to be stopped. You know, you had Germany and Otto von Bismarck, who was again an admirer of Lincoln and applied the Zollverein, the American system, retooled by Friedrich List in the case of Germany, to unite it around a protective tariff, but also an internal improvement focus, so that capitalism in those worlds wasn't really either free market and it wasn't libertarian, it wasn't communist. It was very much something different from what we're taught in schools today. But it wasn't just based on an internal German only, ignore the world, French only, ignore the world, Russia only, ignore the world. There was a foreign policy association with that, very much tied to looking to your neighbors for peace deals, looking for points of win-win cooperation with people who might otherwise be inclined to hate you or fear you because of some linguistic or religious difference. So you had the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, also advanced quite a bit under von Bismarck and then his allies after he was flushed by an overly paranoid Kaiser who enjoyed flattery way too much from untrustworthy occult circles. We had even the case of even in Russia. So that the Berlin to Baghdad railway is something which certain figures within the Ottoman Empire in those days realized they needed if they were going to get into the 20th century and modernize. They couldn't just keep on stagnating and being an increasingly weaker old man of whatever the Eurasian zone. It was only a matter of time before they would be carved up and destroyed. So that was something that could have changed the course of history, with an idea of an east-west rail connection between Christian world, Muslim world, and many other investors internationally. You had Russia. Even after Witte was flushed by the cousin of the Kaiser, Nicholas II, who again, I think trusted flatterers in his courts a little bit too much, and fired Sergei Witte, the brilliant strategist who built the Trans-Siberian rail line. Even after that, you had allies of Witte who are working to build rail connections down through what's today Mongolia into China, down into the other central Eurasian zone. And they were always working together with the peacemakers in Europe around the Bismarck network, who could see that the British were very, very intent on sparking a new 7 Years' War type of forever war between adjacent nations. So you had, unfortunately, with Bismarck gone, a lot of those peacemakers lost a brilliant mind, and missteps began in an increasing intensity. But also, the missteps were assisted by the murder of competent statesmen. There's dozens of statesmen all over Europe and all over Russia who were killed. In Germany as well, by often London-affiliated or at least directed anarchist terrorist movements that killed McKinley. And people who don't know about how McKinley was murdered by an anarchist who is associated with the Neo-Malthusian League, Emma Goldman. She was a member of the British Neo-Malthusian League. When she was in prison, it was Bertrand Russell who came in, bailed her out, got her to Britain. She had a whole commune of cultists who were doing weird things together, and would occasionally be, you'd have a useful Charlie Manson type of persona generated within these communes that could be deployed to carry out something they didn't even understand what they were doing. And this is sort of a technique that was honed and refined around the world. And if you look at it, London provided the basis in 1870 of the International Anarchist Conference, where you had Prince Kropotkin, a major anarchist leader of Russia, who was down in there working with even Mikhail Bakunin. They were collaborating, discussing. Another anarchist who were very much happy with London's liberalism. Just like today, they call it Londonistan. You've had something like 20 different government leaders over the past 30 years petition Britain to say, please stop giving sanctuary to headquarters of various terrorist groups, Tamil Tigers and other things like Egypt and Pakistan and Sri Lanka and India, and so many nations have begged Britain, please just shut down the hosting the terrorist groups. And the response is, well, look, we're a liberal nation. We don't judge as long as people abide by our rules. We don't ask what they do in their own country. And that's not a new thing. They were doing that back with the London Conference and all of these things back in those days too. Even the Serbian Black Hand that was deployed to kill Archduke Ferdinand seems to have some indirect but interesting connections, as does the Organization Consul that killed Walter Rathenau, the foreign minister of Germany, who was trying to work with his Russian counterparts, right, in 1922 to end the destruction of the Versailles Treaty agreements that everyone knew was going to lead to a new phase of global war if you continue to destroy Germany, destroy their people, while at the same time promoting the type of fringe groups that were of a hardcore Nietzschean bent, like what we saw with Hitler, who were just waiting in the wings, right? And the Organization Consul, after killing like 300 German statesmen on a municipal federal level, I think Rathenau was probably the greatest trophy, who were all assassinated after World War I and between 1924. The Organization Consul didn't disappear. It was illegalized under that name, but was rebranded with the same membership and became the paramilitary branch of the Nazis by the late 1920s. So you have all of these things incubated and cultivated by supranational, globally extended intelligence networks, usually centered in London with, branch outlets in the United States that are not representing the interests of the British people or the American people or the German or Russian or Ottoman people. And it's just so important that I think today that there's such a polarization, right, that we're seeing amongst people who should know better, who understand that there are, they've woken up to the uglier picture behind official narratives of 9/11 or great resets or whatever. There's enough people who at this point should and have woken to those the higher historic agencies pushing us in a very bad direction, but who are still falling into profile around either being 100% like pro-Israel, Palestinians are evil, bad terrorists, or pro-Palestine Israelis are just pure evil, it's the Jews. And everyone's like, so many people, not everyone, but so many are just forgetting what they should know about how this, whenever you see something world-changing happening in any sector of the world, it's the cause of that is almost never found within that particular region that's being lit on fire. There's always something broad, much bigger that you have to keep your mind top down focused on to start setting a context to understand, well, what is really going on in this region? Why were the Arab back 100 years ago? Why were the British? Why was Lawrence of Arabia deployed as an Orientalist into the Bedouin tribes? Right? What was he doing? He was trying to organize an Arab uprising against the Ottoman Empire. And what was the British doing? They were promising freedom and liberty to the Arab states, and some financial and other benefits to the Bedouin and other tribes that would carry out the war of liberation against the suppressive Ottoman Empire. And Britain just cares about your freedom. That's all. We obviously we're going to get our benefits too, because we'll have one less rival to worry about. So don't worry, we're not altruistic, but we ultimately care about your freedom, and we'll support your independence. And it became like an Arab Spring. It became like a bunch of useful idiots were deployed by these and people underestimate, I think, the sophistication of British intelligence, which is much more competent than American intelligence or French imperialism. The British are really good at immersing themselves in a very high level, sort of sophisticated, maybe they studied the Jesuits, I don't know, but in just to immerse yourself into a target culture, learn the language, the stories, speak with the people, gain their trust, because of course they could trust a white guy speaking their language and knowing their stories and dressing like them and whatever else, of course. But then you're getting to know them and profile them, not because you care about them, but because you're looking for the weak spots in their culture, in their stories, in their identities that you can then, or in their conflicts with their neighboring tribes that you could then exploit, whether in Africa or in India and Pakistan, whatever. And that's what's then used in a very systemic way. So the Ottoman Empire goes down. These countries, these Arab leaders, they don't get the freedom they were promised. Yeah. They're entirely backstabbed as Britain all of a sudden gives itself British Mandate Palestine through its role in creating the League of Nations under Lloyd George and Lord Milner, the same guys who are like overseeing the creation of the Balfour Accords. These anti-Semite pro-fascists like Lloyd George and Milner, anti-Semites, or even Balfour himself, rabid anti-Semite, are devoted to creating a homeland for the Jews, and at the same time they're really working hard to create a League of Nations that gives them British Mandate Palestine, right? That lets them continue their job of setting Jews and Arabs against each other with selected little provocateurs on either side that are always protected by British intelligence. So it's the same thing. It's the same game plan, although it doesn't work because the world's changed.
So just a few quick points there. First of all, Friedrich List and his economic ideas were also very dominant in Russia in the late 19th and early 20th century. Sergei Witte was, of course, a disciple of List. And by the way, I visited Witte's house in St. Petersburg. Very rundown and broken it is, but it's still an interesting place to see. And List's ideas are currently undergoing a considerable revival in Russia. It's about the only place I know where he's actually still taken seriously as an economist, and you actually find that his ideas get taught in economic schools, which is something quite interesting, by the way, and which has gone largely unnoticed. Secondly, about the British having this ability to immerse themselves in other cultures. Well, this is, of course, true. It is again a legacy of empire, the kind of empire that the British ran. And of course, Edward Said's book, Orientalism, which is coming for a great deal of justified criticism. Nonetheless, I think he did actually come to many of the conclusions that he did based on his experiences in London and about the way in which the British used their research into the cultures of India, the Middle East, wherever, more for the purpose of control than for any other real purpose. It was really get to know these people, the better to control and to manipulate them, to know which particular buttons you should press. I have to say, from my own experience, the British intelligence services of today are a shadow of what they were in Lawrence of Arabia's time. We're nowhere near up to those kind of levels anymore. But where do we go from where? You've explained how we got to where we are, and a lot about the sort of explanations for the underlying events. Where do we go from here? We have this enormous crisis now in the Middle East. We've got China, which is very familiar with all the tricks of the trade that you've been talking about, the ones that aren't working anymore. The Chinese, of course, experienced all of that in the 19th century and thereafter. If you go to China, you find that their memory of all of that is very vivid to this day. The Russians, of course, know it very well because they've experienced it not just before, but in modern times.
Yeah.
So where do we go? What does the West in these kind of situations do? Do they escalate? Do they draw back? Do they try diplomacy? Do they understand the underlying weaknesses of their own economic system?
Yeah, this is the difficult big question, right? Because what are they capable of doing is one question. Like with the current configuration of players in play right now amongst the majority of the Western so-called transatlantic nations, do they have the capability of thinking through basic problems that they've largely created for themselves? Obviously, because I could say, and we should say, like, what is a sane, competent way of diffusing this and creating a better future? We should talk, because there's an immense amount of very sane things that can be done, that the Russians, the Chinese, they have been working very hard diplomatically to awaken as a spirit in their Western counterparts over many years. Many lucrative offers to build infrastructure together. We had the Chinese ambassador to Canada back in 2016 openly offer Canada with this incredible proposition to work on international Belt and Road Initiative deals, but also to help us build things that we forgot to build ourselves as far as infrastructure in Canada and the Arctic. We could still do these things. It's not like China and Russia wouldn't be happy if we chose to have a healthier competition based on who can build more infrastructure than the other rival. That's a much healthier version of competition. But they're not able to. I think they had a little bit to work with the figure of Donald Trump while he was there in the presidency. And there was, despite all of the challenges that he faced with the perpetual witch hunt, Russiagate, all these things, there was at the very least an understanding that there was a desire for positive relations with Russia and with China. Deals for the Arctic that involved benefits to Canada, like the Alaska-Alberta rail line that Trump gave an executive order supporting. And it would have gone straight through Alberta into Alaska. And the entire focus of this was the Asian growth model, that would have been the driving force incentivizing this massive 5-year program. And it's a long overdue thing. This should have been done back in the 50s, the connection of rail between Canada and Alaska. It's never been done. There's a 1,000-kilometer gap still, which would just be an incredible boon to world needs as far as the resources in the Canadian Arctic, as well as Russia, Alaska. That was a little Freudian slip there. But but the amount of not just incentives financially, but just the amount of resources that could be gleaned that could go towards real global reconstruction, and that includes Africa, the Middle East. There's so many things. We're not doing that. We're really doubling down on this Thrasymachos logic from Plato's, Republic, Book 1, of might makes right. This type of very obsolete dark age thinking of my will to power is all that defines what should happen. If I have power and I have will, my power to impose that will and satisfy my desires is all that matters. So we're missing a lot of these opportunities. And as such, even though we're seeing, I think like Zelensky, I think the real emperor without clothes is finally becoming, unfortunately, revealed for people who don't want to imagine Zelensky naked. But there's things like that where we could see that now that Ukraine is no longer, it's not even on the back burner. It doesn't even look like it's going to necessarily get the promised funding that Biden promised. You have just an enmeshment of actions that are taking the West into a state where they're missing the fact that they're risking a real major conflagration. They should say, look, we're sitting on a time bomb. The financial system is going to collapse. We need to reorganize it. And Russia and China have demonstrated a competent industrial economic plan that is viable, could help us rebuild our healthy economy, the real part of the economy. And we should work with them. That humble pie is not something that the West is ready to eat yet. So I don't know how bad it has to get before a bit of humility and desire for self-preservation can be awoken in representatives of Western powers. Obviously, you have this a bit on the outskirts of Eastern Europe. You have some sanity coming out of Hungary, some of the Eastern European bloc nations that recognize, that are taking the lessons of history more seriously. But we're drunk on a lot of Kool-Aid in the main European, Western European, North American community. And I think here the population needs to get more intelligent in how they're thinking of their relationship to their government process, because a lot of people are just sort of sitting on the sidelines, either waiting for QAnon white hats to save the day, or just black pill to the extreme, waiting for hell on earth to just unfold, and they've got their stock and pile of canned goods ready to fight zombie apocalypse. And not enough people, I think, are thinking in this sort of constructive way as citizen activists that need to take responsibility, organize town hall meetings, really be more present instead of just on social media and thinking that that's your battle platform on Twitter or X, right? Which is where a lot of people, they live in that domain digitally, and then they forget there's this whole world around you that you're not really participating in. So that's part of the change in mindset too that has to go into any discussion about the future. But Russia and China understand it. The BRICS understand, I think, the nature of the dirty games very well. That gives me a lot of hope that they're not willing. They've shown a lot of self-restraint, and despite the fact that Israel, under the current administration, which again doesn't represent Jews, it doesn't represent the Israeli people living there. This is a very, very psychopathic faction. It's like they're trying to pick a fight, it seems, almost with the entire Arab world, which is difficult for me to wrap my mind around. Like, why are you choosing now at this moment? You had pre-knowledge of the attack from Egyptian intelligence 3 or even longer days before the actual attack. You did nothing. Now you're committing to this thing, this potential ground invasion, knowing that the majority of the Hamas soldiers have integrated tunnels below the surface area where you're killing mostly civilians, in the using white phosphorus, other illegal forms of attack, destroying schools. UN workers are being killed. The churches are being killed. Mosques, destroyed mosques. You're doing this damage, creating intergenerational hostility, inflaming the anger of the entire Arab world, and then you're attacking Syrian. You're doing strikes on Syria. You're doing strikes into Lebanon. You're bombing towns inside of Egypt on the border of Gaza. Like, it's like you're trying to pick a fight with the entire Arab world, assuming what's the game plan of these players doing this? I don't fully know if it's purely rational. I don't even know what the game plan is necessarily. I know Pepe Escobar wrote an interesting document that I just read 15 minutes before we began. I don't know if you guys saw it, where he's putting forth a very positive, optimistic view that this is all part of a plan arranged by Russia and China and Iran with Hamas, and maybe they've set a trap that the West is falling into. I find it interesting, the composition of thoughts. Maybe it's true, but I don't think so. I mean, Hamas is not something I trust. I don't even know what the game plan was of Hamas. Did they want to just get rid of Israel? Did just have them go away and disappear? Did they want some sort of to force the hand into of Israel into a discussion about going back to the pre-1967 borders? No, they don't want that. Part of their charter is no Israel. Part of the problem is also Hamas seems to have been created as an outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood and with the support of Israeli and American intelligence in the first Intifada. So I don't trust the Muslim Brotherhood, especially considering that some of the key figures who created the damn thing, like Al-Afghani, who is the sort of ideological founder of Salafism back in the 1870s, 1880s, was on the payroll of the British Cairo office based in Egypt. And Hassan al-Banna, according to the writings of Robert Dreyfus, who did some amazing research into this, was in 28 founding the Muslim Brotherhood with the support of the British Suez Company, that gave him money to set up the Muslim Brotherhood, working with other British operatives like Haj Amin, who was a provocateur who was installed under British Mandate Palestine, who maintained a huge amount of influence and kept that sort of eye for an eye revanchism going between Jews and Palestinians, protected again by the British, who also installed Rabbi Isaac Cook as the head of the head rabbi under British Mandate Palestine, representing the Ashkenaz Jews, who was also a provocateur, working with Jabotinsky, calling for greater Israel, setting up yeshivas that produced all of the worst elements of these, these figures that, I mean, Netanyahu's father was the personal secretary for Jabotinsky. If you look at the map of what these guys wanted, was not just like Israel purged as it is today of any living Palestinians, but greater Israel involved, like, look at the map of it. It was like a big chunk of Egypt, Turkey, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, like all of that was what they believe is in the divine will of God to give to the chosen people. And it's like, you got Rabbi Cook installed and protected by the British, by American intelligence after the Mossad is created with the help of the CIA. They're working with Nazis, right? The CIA is working with unrepentant, unreconstructed Nazis, like Otto Skorzeny and others in Operation Gladio, being absorbed into West German intelligence all over South America. We know how operation's been put to work. But then the Mossad is also paying Otto Skorzeny and Walter Rauft and other unrepentant, unreconstructed Nazis who are based in Syria and Egypt at the time to give them intelligence about what's going on and what's happening in the Arab world. And they're now getting directives from Nazis as part of this, like, anything goes Cold War mentality. So of course, things get insane and worse as this and it's difficult to bring in. I'm doing all of this to get at your basic question, which is like, in dealing with where is this going, it's hard to deal with it from a purely materialistic Mackinder language of geopolitics, because there's this element of crazy, of religious fanatical crazy that is also a factor to put into the calculus, and it doesn't fit into the machine, the calculating machine, when you have we are the divine chosen people, and you've got people. One of the things Rabbi Cook even said, which is, I think, even is very important, is he was a believer that it's man's duty to ultimately help fulfill prophecy of global conflagration in order to usher in the Messiah. He believed that. And his yeshivas, again, produced some high-level people working throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s to today in the settler movement and British and in Israeli intelligence. But he even said in the Orot, a book he wrote, saying the truth concerning the land is revealed in Kabbalah. Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, militates for life in the land of Israel. Rationalistic approaches to Judaism place no special value on the land of Israel. In wars, national characters crystallize. Israel, as the universal reflection of mankind, benefits thereby. The heels of Messiah follow upon world conflagration. At the hour of the downfall of Western civilization, Israel is called upon to fulfill the divine mission by providing the spiritual basis for a new world order.
Yeah.
And he's saying this in the 30s, and these guys really have this weird relationship philosophically to their holy texts. The Kabbalah is a weird one that is used to interpret the remarks as though it is to be a good Jew and make the Messiah come, you have to act into or live out, help facilitate the type of global war scenario. And you got the same thing with the Christian fanatics as well, that were largely, brought online around the rapture cult in the 19th century, around the British Darbyists who toured America, creating different sects across America. They had the what do you call it? The Plymouth Brethren in Britain itself that produced Aleister Crowley's family. And so many Satanists came out of this weird pseudo-Christian fundamentalist sect. But then inside of America, you had all these Darbyites who were sitting on their barn rooftops in the Civil War, waiting to be raptured up, because Darby interpreted some texts inside the Bible as being like the fulfillment of end times. And every time something bad happens, it's like, oh, now it's the end of the world. But some of the followers of Darby who become, the Pat Robertsons, the John Hagees, all of these evangelical Christian fanatics who support the growth of the neocon monster, they start, thinking, well, maybe it's our job, if God wills the end times to make the Messiah come, maybe it's our job to help be instruments for God's will to burn the earth. And so you got that crazy thing just floating there. And there's a variation of this also in the Islamic world too, with the Mahdi coming back if under some apocalyptic scenario, helped out by mankind. And it's out of this perversion of Islam as well that Zbigniew Brzezinski was able to profile with the help of Bernard Lewis, the British Orientalist grand strategist who provided the Ark of Crisis logic in the 70s and in the 60s. They were able to sort of use that thing that had been incubated in the Muslim Brotherhood world, the Salafists, the Wahhabite sort of sects of Islam that interpret things in the Quran that incline one, doesn't guarantee you will be, but it makes you more inclined towards a more violent jihadi lifestyle than you would if you were like thinking about the Quran in a slightly different philosophical tone. And this is what was cultivated to groom what became Al-Qaeda in the 80s in the Middle East. So you got these crazy factors at play, again, cultivated by often competent or incompetent, I don't fully know, probably incompetent to a certain degree, but brilliant in another way, intelligence projects, intelligence agencies that are pushing this thing, thinking that they can control it. But I don't think they can. I think that when you let that crazy genie come out of the bottle and gain too much political traction, it's a gamble even for those who pulled it out of the bottle, even for those imperialists wanting that genie out of the bottle. It often blows up in their faces. So I think we're at that sort of moment now as well.
I agree. A couple of many points there, but let's just a few. Firstly, about the Israeli government not speaking for everybody in Israel. All I can say about that is this: I've been reading the Israeli media, and I am very impressed indeed. I have to say this by the diversity of opinions, the sophistication, the intelligence, the critiques that you get. If you want to find the most well-constructed, well-thought-out criticisms of what the government in Israel is doing, you will find them in Israel. The level of debate there is much higher than you will find, for example, in Britain at the present time. And that, I find, a very reassuring thing. And by the way, there are secular Jews who criticize what the government is doing. There are Orthodox religious Jews who criticize what the government is doing as well. So it is widely across the spectrum. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The second is, I have read Escobar's piece. I think it is straightforwardly wrong. I think that the very last thing that the Russians would ever countenance, given the problems they've had with Islamist terrorism themselves, is they would certainly not work with a movement like Hamas to launch the kind of operation that Hamas launched on the 7th of October. And that isn't at all the Russian style, and it's not the Chinese style either. I am absolutely sure that the Russians and the Chinese were not setting out to lure Israel into any kind of trap. On the contrary, I think they have been horrified by these events, both what has happened and what they want, what they fear may happen, and they want to bring it all under control and to stabilize the situation and to seek some kind of long-term peace in the Middle East. The third, which is about all of these eschatological things that you've been talking about, and the way in which tragically and disastrously Western governments, perhaps primarily that of Britain, which has a long history of involvement with groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in the past. Anyway, the fact that these dangerous eschatological ideas are there, that they do exist within the world of Islam and in other societies, unfortunately that is true, and we have seen the consequences and the products of that. But I also happen to believe, and in fact I'm confident in what I say, that these are minority views amongst these societies. And I think most people within these societies recall from these. I said that, Orthodox Jews in Israel often are strong critics. Many of them are extremely strong critics of these kind of ideas. I've encountered that from friends of mine in the past. I haven't lost contact with them now for many years, but friends of mine in the past who were Orthodox Jews and were aware of these ideas and were deeply, deeply antagonistic to them and considered them to be theologically wrong. So I have to say all of these things, but it does seem to me that there is a way forward. We do see some kind of resistance developing around the world now, and it's becoming an organized resistance to this kind of imperial thinking, which, by the way, I agree does have its focal origin point in London. Remember, I live here and I've interacted with many people in Britain, including people from the establishment. Well, they don't talk to me anymore, but they used to. And I know the kind of mindset that they have. I used to be a member of the club, one of the clubs in St. James's. I know all about that kind of thing. So I agree. This is where it started from. And if you look at the map, if you see Britain, what a relatively small country it is relative to the world, and you think of the power that Britain achieved, you can understand why, in order both to achieve that power and to maintain it, the British did have to go down some very dark corridors indeed. But I am at a total loss to understand why big countries, self-sufficient countries, countries with strong democratic traditions like Canada and the United States should follow in the wake of what Britain did. And I've discussed this many times about the United States, which of course began in a revolution against the British Crown, which the British never forgot and never forgave throughout the 19th century, by the way. But why does Canada, which is a country I used to admire and look up to, do the same thing? I mean, the Canadians were there loyally doing what the British wanted them to do in the First and Second World Wars. The better part of the British Army in Europe in both world wars was Canadian. In fact, many people don't know. Why do the Canadians do the same now? Why are they so supportive of these plans and schemes and plots and things when I cannot for the life of me see what possible benefit they gain from them? You've talked about building the railway to Alaska. Build the railway to Alaska. Develop your own country. Build up your industries. You have the raw materials. You have the people. You have the organizational skills. Act independently. Can you explain why Canada takes a different route? Because I simply don't understand it.
Yeah, I can. Well, I wrote a series of books called The Untold History of Canada, 4 volumes, and I'll mail you guys actually a set. But it's a tough one, and there's a lot of. It's a great question, and I think part of it is that Canada, we've been sold a form of branding of nationalism over generations. It's a multi-generational thing built on fallacies and fallacies and fallacies that become enshrined as sacred stories that create sort of a concentration camp in the mind of people who are comfortable with certain grand narratives, meta stories, right? And again, it's part of our education system. It's incubated over many years. That here's one of the core characteristics of the sacred story for Canadians. We sound a lot like the Americans. You know, I mean, if you're an Albanian listening to Alex Christoforou and me having a chat, it'll be hard to tell which one of us is Canadian. I mean, it's not easy. We look kind of like our cousins down south. You know, we all come from a European stock generally, and but we're qualitatively different. We're superior because we didn't have to bloody our hands with revolutions for freedom or never had to fight for anything. We knew that just by being loyal to the monarchy, in time, the slightly overbearing but overall virtuous mother country would grant us those liberties that we finally got. And now look, we now have all of our liberties. We have freedom, and we didn't have to fight. And we have a constitution that we're told, which we don't actually, because you read the damn thing, and it basically says in 1867, this thing that was written during the Civil War itself in 1864, it was drafted in the Civil War to keep Canada strategically locked into the British great game, because there were a lot of pro-Lincoln figures with political power in Canada at that time who were working very hard to deal with, to keep Canada, one, neutral, number two, who were trying to deal with the Confederate intelligence operations in Montreal, Kingston, Toronto that were running coordinated terrorist activity down from the north into the south against Lincoln from the north. So he had two different Confederacy operations that he was fighting. There's two confederacies that were working to destroy the Union that was established in 1776. And as I made the point in my book series, only one of those Confederacy operations that were shaped by the British actually succeeded. The Southern Confederacy failed. The Northern Confederacy did succeed. The pro-Lincoln figures like Isaac Buchanan, who was in control at the time of a very different liberal party, was purged. There were some assassinations. Darcy McGee was killed, one of the founding fathers or co-writers, as we're told he is, an Irish Republican, was killed, who is one of the fathers of Confederacy, they say, but he wasn't. And we were given a new constitution, and if you read the damn thing, it's very different from a legitimate, authentic nation's constitution. Like the U.S., it's, we the people. It starts from the standpoint that the nation exists for the purpose of maintaining the general welfare, common defense, both now and into posterity. In the case of the Canadian Constitution, it just says, in order to, in its preamble, to further the interests of the British Empire, we grant this confederation of these four provinces, and the rights are given to us. It says they're not inalienable. In the case of a real country, you recognize rights as being inalienable because we all have common heritage as humans, with a desire for self-perfectibility, self-respect, dignity, love of freedom. That's where the cause of rights comes from in the Declaration of Independence, or any nation worth its salt. In Canada, the rights are given to us by whatever hereditary figure is there, and implicitly that means they can also be removed when it's expedient. So there's no idea of something inalienable. It's given from the outside. And geopolitically, like I mentioned, the murder of Lincoln couldn't have happened were it not for British Canadian operations housing, giving all sorts of support to Confederacy outlets inside all across Canada. That John Wilkes Booth came here for 5 weeks, got his orders, his money. He was even found with his at his hostel after he killed Lincoln with a banknote from the governor of the Bank of Ontario, Henry Starnes, who was awarded and made mayor of Montreal right after the Civil War. So you had this whole international conspiracy that involved using Canada as a basing operation during the Civil War, after the Civil War. And Lincoln's murder. Jim Garrison, the district attorney of New Orleans, also pointed out in his On the Trail of the Assassins that were it not for the coordinating hand of Permindex, based in Montreal, run by Louis Mortimer Bloomfield, a high-level friend of Prince Philip and Prince Bernhard, a co-founder of the 1001 Nature Trust in 1968. That Mortimer Bloomfield, who was vice president to the World Wildlife Fund under Prince Philip. That guy, right, worked with Maurice Strong the whole time. That guy was overseeing Permindex, was kicked out of France by French intelligence after Permindex was found to be behind at least 2 of the 30 assassination attempts against de Gaulle. They were kicked out of Switzerland too. And Clay Shaw was close friends with Bloomfield and the whole thing. Anyway, Jim Garrison wrote the book on it. People need to read On the Trail of the Assassins if they want to know what I'm talking about. So you have, again, British. Canada has been used, unfortunately, and this is the hard pill to swallow for Canadians. We've been used largely to be at different times a wedge against the potential emergence of U.S.-Russian cooperation, which has characterized U.S.-Russian relations for the last 250 years. It's not been the Cold War hostility. It was Russia that made the American War of Independence possible by Catherine the Great's orchestration of the League of Armed Neutrality. The fact that Russia has rail was made possible by cooperation around John Quincy Adams networks like George Washington Whistler, the rail engineer sent to Moscow to build the first St. Petersburg to Moscow railway in the 1840s. That was built with the assistance of American economists and engineers. The Russian saving America during the Civil War. That's why the U.S. didn't dissolve back then, despite the Darbyites and Rapturists sitting on the rooftops not wanting to fight to save the Union, and Lincoln was getting pissed. He's like, "Look, it's not the end times. Pick up a rifle." But despite them, it was Russia sending in their naval ships to San Francisco and New York as a direct message to the French and British powers that if you go in officially, we know you're already supporting the South by building warships for the South, like the SS Alabama and other warships, and you're supplying logistics and money like the U.S. have been doing to the Syrian Free Army, to overthrow Assad. We know that the British are doing this. We know that the British have 20,000 troops stationed in Canada ready to invade militarily. We know that the French have troops in Mexico ready to invade from the south to back up the Confederacy. We know that. But if you do, it's casus belli against Russia. So Russia saved the Union. And in the outgrowth, you had the American system blossom under Alexander II and III, and with again rail development, industrialization, the liberation of the serfs, the training, the worker co-ops, and the training of Jews who had been put in pogroms to become trade unionist leaders, industrialists, working with Sergei Witte, getting support, and also inversely being weaponized by Witte's enemies in the Okhrana, in the Holy Brotherhood, like Zubetov. Sergei Zubetov was one of the arch nemesis of Witte, who was also working with Jabotinsky, who is both an anti-Semite who hated the Jews, as is so often the case, while at the same time one of the earliest promoters of political Zionism. So you hate Jews, but you promote political Zionism. He's also in the Okhrana, so he's overseeing with Rachovsky the creation of the Protocols of Zion hoax. These forged documents that are supposed to prove to the Tsar that, look, Witte is a Jewish stooge of the Rothschilds, and you should reinstate the pogroms, which they do, right? So you're creating all of this hostility. But all that to say, Russia and America have this friendship, and Canada has been used as a wedge to prevent the types of things that allies of Lincoln were discussing with the continuation of Lincoln's transcontinental railway through British Columbia into Alaska, that was sold by the Russians in 1967, right in May, to the Americans under William Seward and Charles Sumner. So that the idea was to always, and Charles Sumner and Seward and others were speaking openly. And William Gilpin was talking openly about not just buying Alaska, but then extending rail and telegraph wires through the Bering Strait, which was then supposed to always have the plan of connecting into the Trans-Siberian that begun in 1890. And British Columbia was an isolated colony, right? There, at the time that this was happening, there was the Hudson Bay Land in the 1860s, which is all private, sort of a subsidiary of the British East India Company under Lord Strathcona, that was separating the 4 western British provinces that were confederated with this isolated British Columbia colony that was going through economic hell. They had the only part of the world they had any relationship with was San Francisco. So the desire to annex to Lincoln's America, which was not yet an empire, that was going to be still a couple of generations more for the Teddy Roosevelt pro-Confederate Pax Americanus to start getting their influence, America was still seen as a beacon of nationalism, anti-imperialism, and it was. And they wanted to annex BC. There was a huge annexation movement that was accompanied with building rail and industrialized activity through British Columbia into Alaska. That all had to be stopped. So that's part of the sacred stories given to Canadians. Ice out everything I just said. Nothing I said has any meaning in any school, any textbook that's given to students or that's published in major bookstores. A lot of it is a lot of the history gatekeepers of Canada's self-story or self-image are usually affiliated. You'll find the most influential ones are affiliated with the Roundtable movement, which was created by Cecil Rhodes and Milner, as you guys know. And their Canadian branch was actually George Parkin, who's interestingly enough the grandfather of Michael Ignatieff, who headed the Liberal Party, and whose other grandfather was Count Ignatieff, the founder of the Okrata, right? And George Ignatieff, the globalist, Rhodes Scholar in the 1940s, 50s. So you got this weird collusion where a lot of these oligarchs who oversaw the overthrow of the Tsar were given sanctuary in Canada back then after World War I, and then created like this. Their families were granted certain privileges to become Rhodes Scholars, and things like that. And if you look at the thing with the Roundtable in Canada, Lord Milner worked with Mackinder, and together Mackinder actually came paid for by the Rhodes Trust in 1909 to deal with a problem in Canada. And Milner and Mackinder both came together, one representing the Fabians, one the Rhodes Trust. But people say, oh, they're representing two different worldviews. No, it's the same thing. They cater to different demographics. But they came together and Mackinder was set up here for about a year and a half with Milner to deal with the problem of the danger of U.S.-Canada economic integration around a Zollverein, which Wilfrid Laurier, our prime minister at the time, French Canadian. He was actually a Republican who fought against Confederation in the 1860s. He became prime minister, and he one of the key things he was trying to do was sort of a new Zollverein, a new customs union. Yeah, to have a protective tariff, but with a pro-industrial economic policy, not the same thing as NAFTA. Because a lot of people hear that and they're like, "Oh yeah, that's NAFTA. See, that was bad. Good thing they stopped that." No, it was different, and he was ousted, as he says later in a letter to Odie Skelton. He was ousted in a coup arranged by the Roundtable movement, and he says, like, now at this point, and the Masonic Orangemen, which at the time in like 1910, something like 1 out of 3 adult males of Ontario were all Masonic Orangemen from the Orange Order. So you had this collusion of these Anglophiles who did oust Laurier. And they subverted the bill that he had passed in Parliament to create this customs union. It was passed in 1911, and they subverted it before it could go into effect. And Milner wrote a book that I cite at the beginning of my volume 4 of the Untold History of Canada, that the three potentials for future of Canada, and he's writing this to, I think, Vincent Massey, who's being groomed to become the head of the Roundtable movement, which he does become in about a decade. At the time, he's just one of these weird young boys under Milner. But Milner is writing that of the 3 greatest paths to the future, number 1 is greater imperial union of Canada with the mothership. And all of these guys at the time were pushing for imperial federation, right? To create a new federation of the global British Empire. They're like, that one's probably not going to work. There's too much pro-Lincoln, pro-American sentiment. There's too much of a desire to industrialize. They probably are not going to do that. Number 2 is greater affiliation with the industrial American policy. That's the greatest threat, he says, of the 3. And the third option is a more robust Canadian independence movement. And he said, this one is the most likely and the preferred of all 3 options at this moment, because he says that the Canadians are boisterously have a feeling of boisterous superiority to their American counterparts, and they're wonderfully ignorant to the subtle forces of history, which makes for the creation of a new nationalism a wonderful prospect for our activities. And so he's working with Mackinder to figure out, how do you cultivate this new identity for Canadians, which that defines our identity around we're not American. That becomes the thing. And that's, if you ask most Canadians, like, what makes Canada? It's like, we have a flag with a maple leaf. And it's like, what does the maple leaf represent? I know for France and for Germany and for every other country, the colors, the symbols represent something of your history. What does that maple leaf mean for the Canadian? It means a maple leaf. We like maple sugar. It doesn't have that meaning. It was created literally as a branding after they ousted a prime minister named Diefenbaker in the 60s, the same year that JFK was killed. Diefenbaker was ousted again by a Rhodes Scholar coup, and I wrote a whole book on that. That it was through his firing of the governor of the Bank of Canada, James Coyne, who was a Rhodes Scholar, that he fell into a trap, and all of a sudden they had this whole Russiagate scandal on Diefenbaker, run by Rhodes Scholars, even within his own administration, that he was unaware of, who orchestrated his downfall and ensured that the Arctic development industrial plan that he had called the Arctic Vision, for building like nuclear powered domed cities in the Arctic, building rail and roads into the Arctic, would never happen. So he never understood it, because he was pro-monarchist. He believed, he was so proud of getting weekly briefings from Her Majesty the Queen. He was like, yeah, this is the greatest pride that I've ever had. I got weekly briefings from the most informed woman in the world, and her Privy Council would keep her updated. And he was getting briefings from the Privy Council and wondering why everything he was doing was blowing up in his face, right? It's like, but I'm getting briefings from the best people in the world. How is it nothing that I'm doing works? And it's like, maybe you should think about who you're trusting. So he's gone. And then from there, we get a maple leaf flag. We've got the new nationalism movement of Walter Lockhart Gordon, who's the founder of the new nationalism, with another guy, George Grant, who's actually the grandfather of Michael Ignatieff is George Grant, who's another co-founder of Canada's new nationalism in the 60s, to say, we're anti-American. Look, America is consumerism. They're warlike. Look at what they're doing in Vietnam. They're bad. We're so good to be this peace-loving country. And, you know, we didn't know that, well, JFK died. What was taking over U.S. foreign policy, and what was RAND? What was the Roundtable? What was the CFR? The CFR that was becoming the mothership of U.S. foreign policy was the American branch of the Roundtable movement. It was never, and that's what Kissinger said, you know, at the Chatham House, his famous May 10th, 1981 Chatham House speech. He says, during my time as Secretary of State, I kept the British Foreign Office more informed than I did my own Secretary of State. And he describes in that same speech the conflict between the two worldviews of Franklin Roosevelt versus Churchill. He describes it at depth, and he says Roosevelt was naive and stupid. I am an adherent of Churchill's view. That was the correct one to go with. And he's saying this in London in 1981. So who did he represent, right? Why was he trained under William Yandell Elliott, the Rhodes Scholar who ran the Chatham House of Harvard, who groomed his young boys, just like Milner groomed his kindergarten of young boys. They have this weird relationship of grooming, of these sociopathic young doers who are going to be grand strategists, like Pierre Elliott Trudeau was Kissinger's classmate under Yandell Elliott, who is assigned his own role of being set up with Harold Lasky at the London School of Economics, right, in 48, 49, before he's then sent around his world tour of the empire and then sent back to the Canadian Privy Council to prepare the groundwork, as he's a member of the Canadian Fabian Society, overseen and handled by F.R. Scott, who's a Rhodes Scholar, one of 5 Rhodes Scholars, who created the Canadian Fabian Society in 1931, the League of Social Reconstruction, as a social engineering, scientific management solution to the Great Depression. That's what created the NDP. Their political branch became the NDP party. That's what Pierre Elliott Trudeau was a part of. His handler was F.R. Scott. He becomes the thing that then they're like, well, okay, the Orange Party of at the time it was the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. They don't seem to be able to have what it takes to get power. People don't trust Fabian socialism enough. So let's rebrand it and let's infiltrate the Liberal Party that was formerly run by Laurier liberals. Like all of the Laurier liberals, they did lose power in 1911, but they got power again in the 20s under William Lyon Mackenzie King, C.D. Howe, Clarence Decatur Howe, who dies of not Howe. O.D. Skelton becomes the anti-Rhodes Scholar external affairs minister, who was Laurier's most trusted advisor. He's the guy who's fighting Lord Milner. Lord doesn't matter. He's fighting the Rhodes Scholars from taking over Canadian foreign policy. So I'm saying all of this in a convoluted way, just to get across that America was recolonized by its own enemy over the dead bodies of people like Franklin Roosevelt, who Stalin said was murdered, was probably poisoned, he believed, by Churchill's people, as he told Roosevelt's son, Elliot Roosevelt, in an interview published in the 1980s, but it was carried out in the early 50s. Warren Harding also died under very mysterious circumstances, was a pro-American, pro-nationalist leader whose early death did a lot to undermine the American nationalist movement. He was a big resistor of the League of Nations that, again, had been created, overseen by people like Lloyd George primarily. Warren Harding had the advisoryship. He was being advised by all of these, what are called the Pilgrim Society, right? So the Pilgrim Society was set up the year that McKinley is murdered. Now the Pilgrim Society is created as part of the elite class of skull and bones freaks inside of the Eastern establishment, who all believe in an Anglo-American special relationship. And they become the advisors, people like Walter Lippmann. They become the advisors of Wilson. They become the people who steer the Council on Foreign Relations when it is set up. And again, a lot of American presidents have to be killed. And there's some attorney generals who are also patriotic who die mysterious deaths during this time that people have been iced out of our history books. And a lot of Canadians, like Daniel Johnson, Le Père, the senior premier of Quebec, also has to die a very mysterious death when he's got a strategy with Charles de Gaulle to bring in he's the guy who invited de Gaulle, his buddy, to come to Montreal to put out a battle plan for Le Monde Francophonie, to have an anti-imperial, pro-scientific and technological development strategy together as a way to revive the anti-Malthusian spirit of France, of Sadi Carnot, of Colbert, and that had to be thwarted, which was done. And Daniel Johnson died, probably murdered. They never did an autopsy, just like Roosevelt, so nobody can say. The day he was inaugurating the Manicouagan 5 Dam, the biggest hydroelectric dam project in Canada's history. So you got all of these stories that are so interesting, and it would make learning about our history so much more fun in high school. But I failed high school history because they don't teach it this way. It's there's no story, there's no truth, there's just facts that you memorize and no drama. So
I have to say, all your descriptions of all these industrial projects and economic projects, the projects to link up British Columbia with Alaska and all of that, it all sounded to me very like Nord Stream, the Nord Stream pipelines. It had a sort of eerie, resemblance to all of this.
Yeah.
I'm going to finish now. I mean, we've been talking for an hour, 17 minutes. I don't know. Maybe Alex, we've had a great deal from you, Matthew, which I'm really grateful for. But Alex, perhaps you want to add some things or perhaps do some questions.
Do you guys want to do some questions? How much time do you have, Matthew?
I'm good. Today's a pretty flexible day for me, so whatever you want.
Let's. We've got quite a few questions. Do you guys want to run through the questions real quick?
Yeah.
See what people are saying.
As you like it.
Chat is saying, yeah. Death Dealer 1341 says, since the U.S. doesn't want war now with Iran, will the carrier groups come back to the U.S., or is the U.S. just telling lies about not wanting to go to war now with Iran?
I'm going to just quickly say, I don't think that the US itself knows the answer to that question. I think there are some people very much within the administration who very much still want a war. And I think these carrier groups, which are increasing in number, are going to give them huge leverage when they're all deployed. And they're going to start pushing ever more for more war. So, I mean, there's that group. There's another group which says, this situation is out of control. World opinion is turning against us. We've got to rein back. So let's not do it. But I don't think that they're strong enough to get those carrier groups brought back. I think those carrier groups are going to remain there. They're going to remain a massive source of tension in the Middle East and of uncertainty, which could provoke all kinds of things going wrong, and a source of temptation. And I have to say that to some people in Washington who want to use them. So I think it's a very, very dangerous situation. And I don't think that we can say definitely that a final decision has been made not to start anything with Iran. Nobody has said that.
Absolutely. I couldn't concur more. There's not a harmony of policy intention. We see splits and schisms within the policymaking class. We see the neocon fanatics falling into profile, pushing heavily Graham and Nikki Haley and even McConnell, extending the brand of axis of evil to now include Russia and China. You can see them frothing at the mouth. Like, this is our time to shine and finally get what we failed to do for 20 plus years of bombing Iran. Now we can do it. You got that crazy factor, but then you also have people who I think are scared shitless of the consequences of that. Aren't necessarily good people, but they kind of are smarter in the sense that they know that that's not going to be in our benefit. So there's definitely confusion in the policymaking circles of Washington, I would agree.
Yeah. Tim Gibson, thank you for that super sticker. Sancho Relaxo says, hoping to learn about Theodor Herzl et al.
Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism in the 19th century. I don't pretend I know a huge amount about him, but I do get the sense that I think he was from Central Europe, but I also get the sense that he was very much involved with the British. And of course, the British at that time already had their eye on the Middle East. One of the things people don't realize about British imperialism is that the British Empire actually grew in size after the First World War. The British were able to insert themselves into the Middle East, just as Matthew said. They stirred up the Arabs against the Ottomans. They promised the Arabs independence. They also, by the way, promised the Arabs unity. The original intention was that there would be a single Arab state, or that was what the Arabs were led to think. And instead, what happened was that the British divided up the Arab world between themselves and France, the so-called Sykes-Picot Agreement. They gave themselves Palestine. They established the monarchies in Iraq and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, basically dividing parts of the Arab world between various families. They set up most of the Gulf monarchies. And of course, they, at the same time as they were doing all of these things, were promising this homeland to the Jewish people in Palestine, which they didn't at that point control. And that inevitably linked them up with Herzl. Now, what exactly the connections between Herzl and the British were, I don't know. Maybe Matthew knows more about him than I do.
Excuse me. Well, Herzl is somebody who I'm going to refrain from speaking too much about because I'm just beginning a more serious, studious deep dive. But you're totally right. There are a lot of points of connection to British intelligence, but I'm going to refrain from speaking directly about him. I do know that it's always useful to look at the top-down broader chemistry in which somebody is acting, whether he was self-aware fully of what he was doing or whether he was a useful stooge. I'm not going to conclude one or the other at this moment, but looking at what I mentioned earlier, there's several paradoxes, anomalies that you want to let your brain zero in on these anomalies. Like the fact that, number one, a lot of the most rabid anti-Semites who wanted to destroy all the Jews were also promoting the Protocols of Zion documents in Russia through the Okhrana. And it was the French branch of the Okhrana that retooled certain pamphlets, like this pamphlet that was written decades earlier called The Discourses between Montesquieu and Machiavelli. And just retooled the language. Like, basically, it's the same language, but just with a slightly different coloring of, like, now it's a Jewish Cabal conspiracy instead of what was being said regarding a Napoleonic conspiracy in the document. So they did this on the one hand, at the same time as those who are promoting it are also, like Zubitov, the head of the Okhrana, are also promoting or trying to organize political Zionism to convince the Jews that, you want to leave, as they're pushing a pogrom story, as they're working with French intelligence, which is also in collusion with the Okrana, working to promote anti-Semitism in France in the wake of the Dreyfus affair, right? This Jewish French soldier who's blamed for being a German spy, which becomes like, this is a psychologically transformative event. Somehow they make it where this creates this idea like the Jews are everywhere, the Jewish bankers, and they got their assets in France, trying to destroy the French people. So this inflames it in France. Yeah, you got it in Germany. The protocols are sold to the German elite through the Ariosophists, these different theosophically connected branches of occultism embedded within the German high command that becomes the Germananen order. That is like the occult hive of the highest level SS operatives who are all reading the protocols of Zion, thinking, yeah, that's it. That's the thing right there. So there is an element of truth. Like, yes, there is multi-generational conspiracies. Yes, there are some Jewish families that are bankers who play a bad role in a lot of these bad things that happen throughout history. But it's framed in such a way that it cuts off any higher agency of causation and puts all of the hate into the hate absorbers that are the convenient Jews. They're always there. And at the same time as these people are doing that, they're doing so much work to try to convince the Jews, whose lives are being made worse and worse across Europe and Russia, to just get out, just leave, go back to this very controlled zone it's going to be super unstable and volatile in a very convenient way. And we'll use you like I think the way I think about it is how a silkworm farmer treats his silkworms. He'll treat them well to the degree that they produce silk, but when they stop producing silk, when they're not useful, you burn them. So ultimately, I mean, my suspicion is that when I heard Henry Kissinger give that interview, you guys might have heard of this in 2012 to the Jerusalem Post when they were asking about the future of Israel, and he said, no, in 10 years. Israel won't even exist. Yeah. And he freaked out the Jerusalem Post journalists and Haaretz. They were freaked out. They're like, what are you talking about? You're Kissinger. You're like pro-Jewish, right? I am concerned when I hear things like that and I look at all these pro-Nazi anti-Semites who are behind the growth of the current configuration of Israel as we know it. And the ideologues who are positioned to be in power over the dead bodies of people like Yitzhak Rabin or Yasser Arafat. Like Yitzhak Rabin and Arafat were actually trying to work on a viable, constructive solution. With all of its problems, there was an idea of economic development by returning to the pre-1967 borders with Oslo. Rabin was working with Shimon Peres and Yossi Beilin and others at the time. And Yasser Arafat with the PLO was also in a more economic, constructive orientation to finding durable peace processes. What happened? Well, one, the World Bank sabotaged Yitzhak Rabin's request in 1994 to use a $200 million tranche of loan towards infrastructure building. And by having an emergency meeting and saying no to Rabin, you can only use the World Bank money or the aid, whatever it was, for debt repayments, but not for what you want, which without that, you're not going to get any durable peace. It'll just be on paper. It won't be useful. You got to get people working towards desalinating water, building things for their kids that'll start healing the multi-generational hostility of revanchism and eye for an eye. That takes economic development. So that was sabotage. And then Rabin was killed, not by a Muslim, but by a Zionist freak sent out from a radical yeshiva that killed him because he was, abrogating God's promise to the chosen people by pulling back from claimed chosen land. And then Yasser Arafat had now to deal with a violent reactionary group like Hamas, which was created, as Chaz Freeman made the point, to be a counterpole to undermine Yasser Arafat by Israeli and American intelligence, because they wanted something that was more religiously oriented, less economically oriented, that would be intrinsically anti-Israel per se, that would make any type of dialogue impossible. And Yasser Arafat had a headache with these guys. And Yasser Arafat, I think there's a Swiss a medical group that took a sample of his dead body in recent years and found that he was poisoned by polonium in 2004. And so you got this effort to just destroy any type of positive orientation in the region. And again, when Kissinger says that, and I look at why did Donald Trump fire Kissinger? Well, Kissinger was in opposition to the Abraham Accords, the normalization of the state of Israel by its Arab neighbors. That was a big part of what Trump was trying to do. China, Russia also were thinking in those lines. That's also why I find it problematic how Pepe is treating his analysis. But they supported the restoration of the normalization of relations with the Arab states and Israel. Economic development is like what we saw with the Berlin to Baghdad Railway a century plus ago that the British had to sabotage. That's what's come back online with the Belt and Road Initiative, reconstruction programs that would make it economically incentivized for Israel to just work with their Arab neighbors. The Arab neighbors would start working with Israel based on mutual win-win cooperation. All of that has come undone. Kissinger was against it. He got fired, but I think this card is potentially back in play. And I don't know what they're willing to risk as far as limited nuclear war. What are they willing to risk to kick over the chessboard and finalize what these pro-Nazis who created Israel to begin with and hated the Jews over a century ago? How far are they really willing to go? And how this could spring out of control in a very easy way.
Let's do some more questions here, and let's get one from the hockey goalie. Key moment in the West due to protests. People finally starting to see the extent to which powerful cultural blocs have been growing due to mass immigration. Neither side in this conflict has our interests at heart until it suits. Don't look back in anger, anyone.
Well, each side in this conflict has its own interests, which are not necessarily the same as our interests, if you mean by our interests those of us in the West. And I think that is inevitable. Obviously, people are pursuing their own objectives in the Middle East, and those are Middle Eastern objectives. The big question is whether or not we should, what we should do, given the extent to which we have ourselves become involved in the Middle East by our long presence there, and involved in the Middle East because of the very large numbers of the Middle East, of people from the Middle East whom we have taken.
Sparky says, I don't believe things would have unraveled so badly if Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II were still alive.
I don't think it would have made any difference. I met her, by the way, very briefly, and we never spoke, but I was there just about a few yards from her. I've spoken to people who did know her. They all speak about a very intelligent person, but I don't think she would have had the control of events that we see today. I mean, from everything that I've heard about her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I tend to agree with that too. I think she was definitely much more disciplined and sophisticated and self-restrained than her husband or her son. She kind of knew her role in a better way. But there's this weird thing too. I don't know if you guys have been looking into this. Have you guys heard of the British Israelite movement?
I can't say I have done.
Weird. It seems to be a real thing, and it's tied to you got the stuff in our pop culture, and so I had heard of things like this because I'd read like Holy Blood, Holy Grail years back, the book that Dan Brown used for his fiction works, and you hear of things that come up in the fiction works like the Priory of Zion, a 13th century order that was created to protect something that was tied to the Grail. Anyway, there's like this Gnostic reading of the Gnostic Christian texts that is at the basis of this belief that there was one of the tribes or two of the tribes of Israel went and settled in Europe, and one of them's from the house of David, and that part of the theology or the cosmology of these groups is that Jesus didn't die on the cross, kind of like the Martin Scorsese movie, right? They take a lot of the stuff and they turn it into fiction, and they blur the line between reality and fiction. But that Jesus didn't die on the cross, that he actually had married Mary Magdalene, had a bunch of babies, one or more babies. One create a bloodline, and that is what the Holy Blood, Holy Grail book points out. It's like the Grail is actually the bloodline, and is protected by the Priory of Zion as an order, and the leading ruling families of the royals across Europe, these old bloodlines, are actually the descendants directly of Jesus. And Queen Victoria actually did believe that she was a British Israelite, and she did believe that she was a descendant. And you got this weird stuff with the coronation ceremony too, like the sprinkling of water from the River Jordan on the sitting monarch, certain references to the Solomon Temple as well, which is strange, in the wooden throne that there's this weird thing that is tied to the whole Anglican Church dynamic that Henry VIII created. That's, again, weird. Yeah, there's a weird factor in all of this that I'm just starting to try to piece together, but it's hard because you're dealing with crazy, but it has an effect in reality. This crazy, so it's I got to figure out how to think about this, but it's a fact.
Well, there's lots about the British royal family, the whole institution of the monarchy, that is very weird. Somebody who has been quite close to it and has even met some of the members of the royal family, I can absolutely vouch for that.
All right. John Roberts says Israel's playing a long, harsh game to export all Arabs in Palestine. Middle East has over 50% world reserves of oil. G7 nations would suffer without oil. U.S. invaded Iraq twice over oil and hasn't left.
There's an awful lot of people in the Middle East who think all the things that you think. And, it may come to that. I hope that we can avoid these apocalyptic scenarios, mass expulsions of people, huge conflicts between the Arab world and the West, oil embargoes and all of those things. But to be frank, the situation is extremely dangerous and could very easily spiral out of control.
Yeah.
Ricardo Alfonso says Canadians are hybristophiliacs for the most part. That's why Canada is usually on the wrong side of history and will always side with the strongest side. They love thugs. Just talk to any average person here.
Yeah, I mean, there's a tendency of not having a sovereign identity, which makes one a little bit inclined to adapt to adaptive behavior. But, there's been moments that I think we have to hold on to as Canadians are concerned. Like, that we didn't go along with the bombing of Iraq when there was a lot of pressure to do so. We had a lot of pressure to build an anti-ballistic missile shield back in 2004 in the Canadian Arctic. We said no to that. Of course, that was a different Liberal Party. You still, you had Chrétien, part of the old guard, not, it wasn't really for the full, he's corrupt. Yeah. But he was still part of the old guard of like old school statesmen who did deals, recognized that it was not necessarily in our benefit to burn the world in thermonuclear war. So you could kind of negotiate with a guy like that. That's why Russia gave him the Friend of Russia award in 2014, because they could see like he did a lot of backdoor diplomacy, making deals with Power Corps and other things in foreign companies. Very important stuff. But again, Paul Martin, mediocre people. But again, they did have a courage that they could say no to the U.S. military-industrial complex and other pressure around issues that matter. But then since then, the Liberal Party has completely been taken over by this technocratic hive represented by Rhodes Scholars like Freeland or Carney and those weird... there's nothing there you could feel like you could negotiate with. And they sort of set the tempo for a lot of what is normal in Ottawa. And the Conservatives and the NDP have their own, operatives position to control and keep those parties in line. The people don't like it. I mean, I think that there's a general sense across the Canadian population that they're not really, their interests are not being represented, but there's a lot of confusion too. State-run media makes it difficult for a lot of people who don't know how to look at alternative media to think outside the box. So there's a lot of problems that we have to deal with in Canada.
Anglo-Rentier oligarch says the assassination of McKinley in 1901 seems to indicate the beginning of the reconquest of the U.S. by Anglo-imperial elites. Does Ehret
I think
agree?
it began before that, actually, if I have to be honest. I think that they were starting, the British were starting to shift their views about the U.S. in the 1880s. If you're talking about London. In the 1860s, during the Civil War, official London, the government of London had been, the British establishment was still extremely hostile to the United States, and they were very active there the British fleet was basically protecting gun runners into the south and doing all those kind of things. But by the 1880s, they began to sense that the US was there to stay, and it was a rising force. They were starting to get the first glimmers that their own strength was not going to be equal to the challenge of maintaining the system that they created. And they were already starting to look towards the United States.
Yeah, I missed the first part of the question. When did the questioner ask?
It was about McKinley. It's saying
McKinley.
that it was in
McKinley. Yeah,
1901
it was
when he
definitely
fascinated that this
yeah,
is when the great
right.
moment came.
I agree with both of what you said. Like what the questioner is asking is that was a big inflection moment. Absolutely, but you're right. Like it had begun before that. The 1880s was a big point. But I would say even if you honestly go back, the reason why I called my book series, I did a second book series called The Clash of the Two Americas, and volume 1 deals with the 18th and 19th centuries. And the reason why I call it that is because I'm trying to get across that if you treat America as though this current deep state discussion is not a new thing, but you could look at every single moment as a continuous function, though punctuated by discrete moments, right? But you could, from 1774 even, before the revolution began, that there has been a fifth column within the American colonies that has always been loyal to the hegemony of the city of London, the global extension of the British Empire, the British East India Company, British intelligence. And one of the earliest moments, like, yes, you had some British United Loyalists who did leave America at the onset of the revolution. And they were given sanctuary in British territories in aka Canada, that was bribed to stay as part of the British. The French territory of Quebec was given the Quebec Act of local controls. You could still have the Catholic faith. We won't force anything on you. You'll have local controls, but stay loyal to the crown. And so the elites of Quebec had a big an alliance with the Anglican intelligence. A lot of them were Jesuit operatives who were like managing the Quebec clergy, but also the financial establishment. It was very seigneurie, a feudal system. So we stayed out of it, and we remained British, and that gave a space for the United Loyalists to go and set up shop, who always pledged fealty to the British Empire. But then it wasn't like you only had patriots left in America. You still had like what you might call Gladio-like stay-behinds, right? People who acted like they were American patriots, but were always working to destroy America from within or undo the revolution from within. And people like Aaron Burr, who largely put into motion what became Wall Street. He took over the Bank of Manhattan, turned it into a speculative hub. In the 1790s, he already had a plan that he tried 3 times to break up the Union by declaring himself, by becoming president in 1800 and separating, as the plan was, and it's written down in archival letters. The plan was to break up the Union, join up with British territories, create a new pro-British constitution, while the slave power of the South would have their own country that would also be pro-British, but again with its own country. So that was tried. It was subverted by Hamilton, who sabotaged Burr's gambit by supporting Jefferson, nominally Hamilton's enemy. But then Burr tried again as vice president. He then ran for governorship of New York, the economic engine of America, and he tried. If he had won it, his plan was to do the same thing again. Hamilton subverted that once more, stopped him from winning the governorship, stopped the secession plan from working. He killed Hamilton, got rid of one problem, but then he tried it again with after Napoleon sold the Western territories to Jefferson. America got a lot bigger, but they weren't states yet. So Burr had a whole plan with Pickering, with a lot of the Federalists, with a variety of people to take control using British mercenaries that would be sent in. British money was going to back the whole thing up, to take the Western territories, declare war on Mexico, war on Spain, Spanish territories down south, Louisiana. And then with that new consolidated power, then depose Jefferson by murder or whatever, and have Burr set up as emperor, with the slave power going free again as its own thing. And that was subverted by a whistleblower inside his conspiracy, who made the point that it was actually Andrew Jackson's home was the headquarters, the base of operations where they planned a lot of this out. And a senator who was part of that conspiracy realized this wasn't going to work. He blew the whistle, went to Congress. They did a hearing. Didn't have a smoking gun at the time. In hindsight, we know now that there was a smoking gun, because archival work in the 1840s
revealed a letter by the British ambassador Anthony Merry to the British Foreign Office of Bentham, which is where Burr went to live for 5 years when he left America in 1807. He went to live with Bentham for 5 years in an opium-infested, prostitute-run Hellfire Club den before being sent back to America to reconstruct his machine. This letter between Merry and Foreign Office basically says, Burr has given us his services. He has a lot of talent. We can use him. So they tried this again. They tried this in the War of 1812 to undo the Constitution and take back America once more. And they did it with the Hartford Convention in 1814 to sever the South as its own country and declare the North a unified nation with Montreal and other British territory. They tried this so many times. So all of America's history, I think, has been largely shaped by the unwillingness of the leading factions of the British Empire and the broader, older families that are represented by that empire, not just British, because it's not a British thing. The British people are not benefiting by the activities of the empire, never have. There's been an unbroken continuity of intention to undo America's resistance and the role model that they created as a colony that broke free and created a republic that is contagious. They've always wanted to put that genie back in the bottle. And that's been misshaping, I think, pretty much every early death of an American president that I've seen, all 8 of them who died while in office, and then add Hamilton and Bobby Kennedy to the list too, right? There's a direct common denominator amongst what the policy is of all of these different figures at different amplitudes, not the exact same thing, but similar principle being invoked at different times, from Zachary Taylor in 1841, after 3 months, Harrison in 1840, then Zachary Taylor, 1851, Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, Warren Harding, FDR, JFK. Like that's a lot of presidents dying. They're all invoking something similar, and they're being resisted by the exact same fifth column operatives incubated inside their country that don't represent America, but are trying to co-opt and take control of America for a more supranational power structure that they're more in harmony with.
From Eyal, why do you see Hamas any differently than a ruling NAZI party? Would you make peace with a neighboring Nazi state that believes in destroying you?
No, I've never suggested anything like that at all. What we discussed, on the contrary, in a program that Alex and I did on the Duran, was that a completely different approach would have been correct to trying to deal with Hamas. And we discussed a possible approach, which was to go straight after the terrible events of the 7th of October, straight to the Security Council, get the UN Security Council to condemn what happened by Hamas before any military action was taken, to demand the immediate unconditional release of hostages and the surrender by Hamas of all of those persons, all those people who were involved in carrying out those murders. And we said that it was most unlikely that Hamas would, in that case, have agreed to those sort of proposals. And the next step would then have been to start warning Hamas that if it continued in its defiance, it would be declared a terrorist organization. And when it was eventually declared by the UN a terrorist organization, UN sanctions under Chapter 7 could have been imposed against it, blocking off its financial support, closing down all its various offices around the world, having its people arrested where they were found, things of that kind. In other words, deal with this organization as a criminal organization whose members and leaders had committed a criminal act. And eventually, that would have, I'm convinced, have caused Hamas to break down and collapse, and negotiations of the kind you are talking about would not have happened and would not have been necessary. What has instead been done is a military operation, which, in my opinion, far from weakening Hamas politically, in political terms, for the moment, has made it stronger.
Sparky says Hamas fighters aren't necessarily aware that they do the bidding of the U.S.
No,
And Sparky, And Sparky says I refuse. And Sparky says I refuse to join any club that would have me as a member. Groucho Marx. And let's do a couple more questions. Do you have time for 10 more minutes, Matthew?
Yep, sure. Somebody asked, by the way, why does my camera keep moving? It's because it's a new camera that has this. It's really expensive camera, but it has like a weird AI thing that, like, if I do that, it moves. There's nobody behind holding my camera. Don't worry. It's a weird thing. It creeps me out too.
Here. Sancho Relaxo says, wow, I was Michael Ignatiev's webmaster for his PM run. We delivered late. His launch promoted a URL that didn't work. My small contribution.
Right. Just to say, Matthew, I had no idea that Michael Ignatieff was in any way related or connected to Count Ignatieff, the Russian statesman of the mid-19th century, who was a formidable individual, by the way. And the Chinese know him very well because, of course, he was the person who negotiated China's cession of the area where Vladivostok was built to Russia. So he's the most interesting man. I didn't know that the two were related.
Yeah. No, it's a definite connection there. Now, there's a lot of weird. I did a whole thing on the Ignatieff family. I'll email it to you. You might enjoy it.
I'd be very interested.
Yeah.
D. Pierce says, love the show. Listen daily. Question: how will multipolarity affect Latin America, given U.S. losing influence in Eurasia and Africa? West can still neo-colonize.
Like Canada. As with Canada, multipolarity might finally give Latin America its independence. And, that this is, Latin America has been tied in to imperial systems, Spanish, British. The British were very heavily involved in Latin America, especially in Argentina and Chile. They were very much part of the British informal empire of the 19th century. Also, the US has been heavily involved in Latin America. The Latin Americans can finally stand on their own. Maybe they will find a way forward to a sustained prosperity within their countries.
I share that feeling.
Let's see. Ricardo Alfonso says British deep state is like Spectre. And Douglas Struthers says
James Bond and Spectre and all those books about Spectre were written by a British writer who had worked, by the way, in the intelligence services. Ian Fleming was actually an intelligence officer during the war, and a good one by all accounts. He was good at his job.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, he's really good. He was very creative, and that's one of the weird things too. He was also friends with Aleister Crowley, and his. There's this weird predictive programming quality for that's very important for global intelligence operations more generally, as far as the longer game, because you got the short game of kinetics, the Mackinder strategies in the material world, but then there's also the setting of the context of this within the zeitgeist that is going to shape the reactions of the people, their instincts, and how they're going to respond to the types of policies that you will be putting into motion temporally. And so when you look at what people like H.G. Wells are assigned to do as far as a fiction writer, it's not just to be a fiction writer to entertain. He's doing predictive programming. And you could see that in especially his nonfiction writings of The Open Conspiracy, the New World Order book that he wrote, and his role with British intelligence working for the Propaganda Bureau during World War I, overseeing with certain other figures who are interesting. Like the whole Beaver Book apparatus is like sort of shaping that program to redefine what the Germans are for the minds of the readers of British and American propaganda as Huns, right? Baby killing Huns. And so there's this idea of needing to rebrand your enemy in a dishuman way, which H.G. Wells is overseeing. He's, again, very effective because he's so creative. He can get into the mind of his audience. He can work on the broad imagination and shape the context of like the world set free, right? It's a story of nuclear bombs destroying the world to prepare the world for the acceptance of a new one world government and a new one world religion, or his Things to Come book as well. That's turned into a movie in the 30s, which is really a creepy movie. Again, the world is we self-destruct in our own natural incompetence, and a one world government is brought in by a Masonic priesthood of social engineers who restores order. And so he's doing all of this stuff. And a lot of these writers who are very effective intelligence operatives are super creative, but they're also, I think it's tempered by a commitment to a system. Their creativity is not bounded necessarily by a moral sense of what's truly right or wrong, but by a commitment to a certain system that they're beholden to as they work for certain power structures, which is also, I think a lot of people overlook that aspect, which is, it's very important to look at.
Michael asks, question, now that we see that Netanyahu regime is seeking to establish a great Israel, will that give a new incentive to defend the two-state solution?
Well, if we get to that situation where people are expelled and a greater Israel is created, then it will destroy any possibility of a two-state solution. And by the way, that will deepen the crisis, because those people who have been expelled will retain their overwhelming sense of grievance. And I don't know whether you've all been watched our program, the program we did some time ago with Glenn Deason and Alistair Crook on the Duran, in which we discussed the ideas that actually Matthew touched upon to recreate the temple. If that all starts to take shape and form, then we're going to see a deeper crisis in the Middle East. I think this is a thing that people in Israel, perhaps, I think a lot of people in Israel actually do understand this, that a further expulsion is not going to solve Israel's security problems. It's going to make them worse.
Yeah. I would just add one thing to that. And I'm glad you brought up the temple thing, because that's a big one, obsessive one in the minds of some of these more fanatical elements. But I noticed that starting in, at least as far as I could find, in 2008 is the earliest I could find it, but I think it's been going on earlier, is a dispute within the Sanhedrin around how to interpret this idea of the obligation to reconstruct the third temple at this particular mound site. And the fight was around whether or not we need to destroy the Holy of Holies, like the temple that already, the Dome on the Rock that currently exists there, in order to build the temple at that exact moment, or can we build it like right next door and not have to necessarily go to total holy war? And I know that this was being entertained within certain factions within Russia for a period. This hope that maybe we could appease, because you can't really appease people who are not bounded by logic. And there is a giant faction within Israel, not giant, doesn't represent the Israeli people, but there is a significantly influential faction which is ideologically committed to, we need that Temple Mount built. Otherwise, we are going against God's will. So how do you appease that, diffuse it of its World War III potential, and still, yet give it something that it wants? So I think that there was that going on. But if you allow for some sort of a greater Israel thing, forget about it. I mean, that's if you purge the Arabs from Palestine completely, and you go for that greater Israel thing, no, that'll get ugly in so many ways. So many ways. You can't go back from that.
Raphael asks, is Trudeau the worst PM in the history of Canada?
Yes, in my opinion. The ones I remember, I don't know what Matthew thinks.
Yes.
Rafiq Adams asks, question, Matthew has raised the question. Matthew has read the 2009 Brookings Institution Path to Persia report detailing various strategies for Iran regime change. Any thoughts?
Yeah. Well, they tried there's a few propositions on green revolution, Soros style color revolutions that didn't take hold that were outlined in that Brookings document. They're still hoping for it. You had a variety of things that are continuously being attempted. I think Elon Musk's Starlink is supporting some of these foreign operatives who don't even know that they're operatives to destabilize their government for some romanticized idea of Western liberal values that they think the West enjoys. But no, that's not going to happen. It's made it, I think Iran's far too economically stable for a color revolution to happen at this moment. Color revolutions can only kind of occur if you have a lot of economic scarcity and fear. And then you've got a lot as a social engineer to work with, to cultivate a mass mob to go and overthrow their government for reasons that are put there by external actors. You might have it anyway. There are countries where you've been able to do it, some that are still facing it. I don't think Iran currently has to worry too much about that. I don't think.
Raphael says, why did the British general was so cruel with the French in Quebec by sending them to die in Louisiana?
I'm not aware of this particular event. I mean, the British general I always hear about in connection with Quebec is General Wolfe, who got his men to climb the heights of Abraham. I'm sure that Matthew will tell us that this is part of the mythology that people in Canada read. It's what we know about. It's the only British general I know are connected to Quebec. But Matthew, perhaps you could better answering that than I am.
I'll just say it in a simple way. I think that the way the anti-Semitic pro-Nazi fascists cared about the Jews when they created the Balfour Accords is the sort of same type of love that the British have for the French Quebecois. They ultimately will act like they like you. They'll give you local like prestige or liberty or affluence or whatever, only as long as you're useful. But they're more than happy to see all French Canadians destroyed, as the Acadians discovered early on.
Right.
Jeff Rock says, Brett Weinstein commented on how Israel-Gaza has fractured groups who are coming together in opposition to the machine. Considering this and accounting for the Dagestan PSYOP, do you think this all is desperate actors making what they can from events, a coordinated plan, or something in between? With the game turning against the establishment, I can't shake the feeling their Hail Mary is to flip the board via a global holy war and try their luck picking up the pieces after.
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I think that there are lots of plans out there, and I think there's an awful lot of anger and an awful lot of emotion. And I think there's also a lot of people who are doing all kinds of calculating, trying to sort of pursue their own particular agendas. I don't think that for the moment this thing has fully crystallized into a gathering of forces behind a single plan on either side. I think that we're still in that stage where, if you like, the plans are being formed. But the material is there. We talked about the carrier groups previously. We've talked about the fact that various groups in Gaza are coming together. All of this is going to sort of shape things in the future. But whether people are actually all working to clear plans, I doubt it, actually.
Yeah. I mean, it's, Putin has come out working hard to nip this in the bud now. I don't know how much of this is foreign manipulated, how much of this is the consequence of just ethnic hostilities and the feeling of abuse. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Fragments of USSR asks, we'll do a couple more questions and we'll wrap it up. And whatever questions we don't get to in this live stream, we'll answer them in a dedicated Q&A. Let's do like maybe 2 or 3 more questions, and we'll wrap this video up so we can all go trick or treat, I guess. Fragments of the USSR asks, was there any connection between the British Special Services and the establishment and dissolution of the Communism International?
Right? Are you referring to the Comintern or the international or the Soviet Union and the communist state and the revolution? The British had a very elaborate intelligence operation in St. Petersburg in 1917. If this is something it's not even disputed. We even know some of the agents who were present there, and they'd had a very elaborate intelligence operation in Russia before the First World War. Exactly what these people were doing and what role they were playing, it's very difficult to say, because the British themselves have not revealed all the details. And to be frank, I suspect that most of the archives have by now been destroyed. I doubt that the British would have kept us completely, fully informed about what was happening. But certainly it is the case that in the run-up to the revolution, there were very strong British influence in Russia, which was being exerted in a particular way. And Matthew didn't mention it, but we've discussed it, Alex and I, in our History Channel program when we talked about Russia. I mean, the British were very strongly involved, supporting various liberal groups in Russia at that time. And the Tsar's interior minister, a man called Durnovo, just before the First World War, a couple of months before the July crisis, actually wrote a memo to the Tsar in which he said, under no circumstances allow Russia to become involved in a war with Germany. If you do, you're simply working to a British agenda, and that Russia has no interest in that. Our interest should be, on the contrary, to have good relations with Germany. And if there is a war of that nature, the high probability is that we will have a revolution. And if we're able to avoid that and come out victorious, as night follows day, the British will turn against us. So that was something that Duran said. So lots going on, and it is not impossible that the British were involved back in 1917 in some of the events that took place in that particular year. Now, about what the British role was in the collapse of communism, if you mean by that the collapse of the Soviet Union. Again, I think here the problem is to some extent the opposite, in that we have a huge amount of information. The British were very opposed to the Soviet Union. But again, it's difficult to pull all the threads together to know exactly who they were connected with and what influence all this had. Because again, we haven't really been told. The British are very good at keeping their secrets, by the way. There's never been a good history of the British Empire, for example. There's never been an official history of the British Empire. Very few people understand exactly how it was administered, for example.
Yeah, that's a good point. I agree fully. There's a lot of interesting researchers who I've discovered a great appreciation for. I would throw amongst them Grover Furr as one of the new discoveries I've made a few years ago. I bought his books on, and he's a Russia scholar who's gone through the archives. A lot of the material was classified for 75 years and only became declassified around like what was the real story. Where we told the truth about Holodomor, about the Moscow trials, about the purges, and like, well, what are we? Is the official narrative got holes in it? Is there contradictions? And he's actually painted a very different picture from what I had been comfortable with for many years of my life. Again, through a lot of just, for the first time ever, archival work. And he also made the point that a lot of the archives, the Harvard archives on Stalin, were purged. It's just gone. Like there's evidence that there was letters in certain boxes, but they're gone. So there was, over the Cold War, a lot of purging. And I think the fact that a lot of the Trotskyists like James Burnham or Sidney Hook and Alan Weinstein later on, who creates the NED, a lot of these former Trotskyists all become neocons starting in 1940, right? So you got this weird transmigration of groupings that were all for permanent war, like permanent revolution, that were also tied to, like, what was Trotsky doing? If you look at what Trotsky was up to in 1905, he was working very closely with Parvus, Alexander Helfand, who later on becomes a leading figure, bankrolling and providing arms and everything else to the Young Turks movement that's used to undermine the Ottoman Empire. That it then creates that enmeshes Russia into, or has a war within the Balkans right before World War I. That's a big point of weakness. Right after Jacob Schiff is getting awarded the highest medal of honor you can get as a foreign citizen by the Emperor of Japan for having supplied $20 million for Japan to go and destroy the Russian naval fleets in 1904, which they do. So Russia's getting weakened in all sorts of ways. But Parvus is behind the growth in many ways of what becomes this neo-Ottoman Empire ideology that comes out of the Young Turks, which itself is sort of like a retooling of the Young Europe movements, the ideology of the way that the young Albanians, the young Germans, the young French, the young Greeks were deployed by people like Palmerston and Mazzini in the 1800s, 1850s, 1860s to destabilize governments that were in danger of going a little bit too much along the Friedrich List orientation of national development, national building projects, working with your other sovereign nations, right, next door to you to build infrastructure. That had to be stopped. So weaponization of the abused people, the alienated people, was a useful technique. The creation of, or the profiling of different people, like the Polish to try to find moments where they had the Polish-Lithuanian grandeur, and the Albanians had their own story of like when they were great and at the top of the tops, and everybody had their own little story that could then cultivate a sensibility of elitism. The Ottomans had their own, like the young Ottomans, the young Turks. They were like, we want to restore back the grandeur of the greatness of the 14th century, 15th century Ottoman Empire, and everybody was cultivated around this. The Ukrainians, we saw where this went with the revival of this superior bloodline thing, and the Trotskyists are just overlapping with some of these higher level things. Jabotinsky, Trotsky is sending his Jewish followers to go and work with Jabotinsky, who's being set up to advance a program for Israel, and do it in a particularly violent way that people like David Ben-Gurion was in total opposition to. So you had the sane Jewish Zionists who wanted to live in harmony with their Arab neighbors, building infrastructure together. Ben-Gurion was overall in that orientation. And then you had the Jabotinskyites, the Herzlites, the Cooks, who were Rabbi Cooks, who were a little bit more into the greater Israel. We gotta have this great grandeur, and it just created a perfect soil for forever wars with your neighbors. Armenia had their own thing. So I'm just saying this because the hand of Western intelligence agencies is everywhere. And I think they really wanted Trotsky to be their golden child. He ran the industrial policies. He brought in Arm & Hammer, who became like Lenin's banker for a while, right? From Oriental Petroleum. Arm & Hammer was kind of like a George Soros figure of the 20s. And like the new economy policy was kind of like a perestroika, the way I see it, of a liberalization of the economy, a privatization of state things in the 20s. And there was a fight between the factions that had one way of thinking about the future of Russia versus another faction. Trotsky lost. His followers all became, again, radical neocons later on, working with McCarthy and or Jabotinskyites. And that's a weird thing. But you're always having British intelligence, Western intelligence everywhere. The cybernetics groupings are coming online after Stalin dies. He banned cybernetics, right? Stalin banned Norbert Wiener's theories in Russia as a bourgeoisie science. As soon as he dies, it's rehabilitated with Trotsky's, the people who were Trotskyites in the Moscow trials are all rehabilitated. And then Khrushchev gives a speech. He doesn't just start a de-Stalinization program from the inside, but he also gives a speech in 1960 saying cybernetics is going to be the operating system of the entire Soviet economy. And this is like a big deal. Just as the Rand Corporation in America is bringing in cybernetics, systems management, using computer models to shape policy on every level into the U.S. Domain, the same networks, often mediated by operations tied to the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis that has an outgrowth out of the Club of Rome. That's a factor, which is there creating like a cybernetics cultist grouping. A science, cybernetics is the science of control, and they create sort of this grouping, this movement in various countries that believe that we need a scientific priesthood above the dirtiness of politics to manage scientifically society. And this is, I think, something that is still a problem that the Russians still haven't fully dealt with. And, the West has this as a big problem. But I think that's also there because of Anglo-American intelligence playing a big role and other intelligence.
Elza asks, how does Canada deal with the SS veteran scandal? Are there any consequences?
None so far.
And let's do one more. One more from locals. BFTE's Eyes Wide says, thoughts on the possibility of the fall of the British Crown after the collapse of NATO. The latter, I think, is inevitable. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to say about the collapse of NATO. Ultimately, everything like that will certainly come to an end, and I'm sure that NATO is in its last period. But that's another subject. About the British Crown, I also have to say this. I think that it is gradually going to fade away. It is becoming much less important in British life than it used to be. When I first came to Britain in the 1960s, the monarchy was absolutely everywhere. It was in every institution. It was hugely supported. It was very much part of the life of the nation. You had every time there was a television news broadcast, it always ended with royal news, for example, telling you about what various members of the royal family were doing. And you don't get anything like that anymore. So individual members of the royal family are popular. And of course, it is very connected to the British establishment that we have today. But I don't think it has the kind of support base amongst the British people that it once did. And without that, I can't see how it can survive for very long.
I appreciate that from a British patriot as yourself. I do appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, I hope that Britain could become a real, just normal country that cares about itself and instead of being ideologically driven by these residues of feudalism that keep pushing us into the abyss. So I have a lot of hope that British can rediscover its better Marlowe, Milton, Thomas Morian, Augustinian roots, and act like a normal country.
Well, we are in a state of crisis here. I mean, we've discussed this many times on the Duran. There's a widespread sense that the economy in Britain is reaching a kind of critical inflection point. That things are working so badly that there is a real risk of a major economic crisis, bigger than anything we've had since the Second World War. There is widespread mistrust and dislike of the political class, like I have never seen it. And together with that, a widespread loss of confidence in British institutions. Now, I think that Britain remains fundamentally a stable country. I don't think we're going to have a violent revolution or anything of that nature. But I think out of this, eventually, a political force will emerge, which will sweep an awful lot of what we're talking about away. And it's long overdue. It should have ended decades ago. One of the reasons we are in the crisis that we are in is that it has been artificially prolonged because of the success that Britain has had in making other parties carry it along with them, the US especially.
All right.
Agreed.
Autocoder asks, thoughts on the recent normalization of crazy UFO tech so they could use it to maintain the unipolar order, 70 years of denial, and now it's fine. That's for you, Matthew. Yeah.
I got it. Okay. So my wife and I we've been working for a few months at a series of documentaries. The first of this 8-part series will be released tomorrow, probably tomorrow night, dealing with, it's called The Hidden Hand Behind UFOs. And we take a deep dive into what's this all about? Why did Lawrence Rockefeller, who worked with Kissinger and Nelson and Henry Luce in 1956 under the Rockefeller Commission for the USA and the New World Order, how did all of these creatures, why did he create the Disclosure Project? Why did Lawrence Rockefeller, who played such a big role in the conversion of the USA into an instrument of empire, create in 1992 the Disclosure Project for the Clinton White House? Why did he hire Stephen Greer, a muscle, a bodybuilding doctor? Why did he hire that guy to be the spokesman for the Disclosure Project right as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed? And why did they recruit John Podesta and Hillary Clinton, who went to the Lawrence Rockefeller Ranch? And Podesta, why did Podesta become a big advocate for disclosure of Roswell in Area 51? Why? And why did a lot of those same operatives around Allen Dulles, overseen by Allen Dulles, like Richard Bissell, who created and ran Area 51, testing out drones, experimental aircraft, why did he and Charles Cabell, the deputy director of the CIA, who created Project Blue Book, why did Sir Henry Tizard, who oversaw the creation of MK Ultra with the CIA operatives, who created the basis of the Manhattan Project under the Tizard Commission in 1940, why did he create the UK Flying Saucer Working Party under the orders of Lord Mountbatten, who believed and advocated for uniting mankind around defense against extraterrestrial threats in 1949-50? Why did all of these figures who oversaw the murder of JFK, who pushed back against them, all promote and work to cultivate this new set of folklores throughout the Cold War of ETs? Because people were seeing something when they looked out their windows, right? Starting in 1947, not before World War II, but starting in 1947, people started seeing things they couldn't account for. How could a story be crafted for the zeitgeist that could reframe what people were seeing and create something more conducive to oligarchical psychological management of people? Because the Nazis, the Germans, and the Italians had flying saucer experimental aircraft programs that they were developing. That's a true thing. That's a verifiably true thing. And a lot of these things, like Victor Schauberger's designs, were absorbed by the U.S. military-industrial complex with many other German rocket scientists. It wasn't just the V2. So people were seeing things. They were seeing new types of drone tech, new types of everything was a veil of secrecy. So you can't tell people what they're seeing. You can't tell unvetted, pilots, fighter pilots, what they're seeing when they look out their window and they see something that they're not sanctioned to see, and they give a report. So what do you tell them? So you have the crafting of a mythos to create partially a new set of sacred stories. And this is why our video series is going to look at the rehabilitation of certain pagan mystery cults of the ancient world, and how a lot of these pagan mystery cults, with their priesthood and all of the geopolitical influence they had before and during the Christian era, how they repackaged themselves. They didn't disappear, right? They repackaged themselves with their occult rituals, rites of initiation, and other things, sometimes masquerading as a Christian sect, but not really. Sometimes having the cult of Mithra, other cults, cult of Gaia, but they repackaged themselves and continue to do exactly what they had always been committed to and are now being revived. And we're going to go into Scientology. We're going to go into L. Ron Hubbard, Aleister Crowley, the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis crowd that was working with German and British intelligence before and during World War I and II, who created the Scientology group as a UFO cult. Their influence today, even behind the scenes and even in the scenes, in promoting the David Grush congressional hearings and testimonies that we're seeing around, revealing UFO stuff. So anyway, there's a lot that we're going to tackle over the course of these videos, but stay tuned. Check out CanadianPatriot.org tomorrow night or the next day at the latest for the first episode written by my wife, Cynthia.
Fantastic. And on that note, I will have all of Matthew's information in the description box down below and as a pinned comment. This is where the live stream for today ends. Once again, whatever questions we didn't get to on this stream, we will answer them in a dedicated Q&A session. Alexander, Matthew, thank you very much for an amazing live stream. Thank you to everyone that was watching us on Rockfin, Odyssey, Rumble, Locals, and YouTube. All right. And thank you to our moderators. Take care, everybody.